The United States' emergence as an up-and-coming imperialist nation occurs as a result of a conflict with Spain over Cuba.
The situation that erupted in Cuba was, to a considerable extent, the outgrowth of our tariff policy. In 1894, we passed the Wilson-Gorman tariff, and the bottom fell out of the Cuban sugar market. And so you've got, as a result, layoffs and wide-scale unemployment, and then the Cubans had been very restive under nearly 400 years of Spanish imperialism as it was. And so that undercurrent of restiveness coupled with the economic decline of that single-crop economy in Cuba, it caused a revolution.
Some of these issues of human rights or domestic outrage over violations came to the fore. That's why the U.S. government became interested in Cuba, because of what appeared to be and what really were violations by Spain of the rights of the Cubans.
And with a revolution 90 miles off of our shores, that was just too good of an opportunity to pass up for the American press, especially the Hearst newspapers and the newspapers of Joseph Pulitzer. They could sell 1 million papers a day sometimes talking about the situation in Cuba and the Spanish attempt to repress the people there and to put down that rebellion. And then you had at the same time that Cuban exile community in Florida, and they were doing all that they could to bring the United States into this turmoil in their homeland.
And most Americans who supported the Spanish-American War did not see it as a war to acquire colonies. But there were people in the American government, and most notably Theodore Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of War, who saw the war in an exactly opposite way.
Now, the specific events that triggered it is that the United States has down there a battleship, the USS Maine, and there's an explosion on the ship. Hundreds of Americans are killed. The immediate response from the press is that the ship has been deliberately bombed.
The Maine was blown up as a result of an act of Spanish treachery. And you had students at Lehigh University chanting, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." And so you had the American public really in a martial mood, really in a national frenzy. Jingoism is what it's oftentimes called.
The 1890s are a period in which the United States is experiencing a Great Depression, the greatest industrial depression that it had known to that point in time. There's high unemployment. Also, there's a good deal of political chaos in the country with the emergence out of nowhere of this phenomenon known as populism, because these very severe social problems were threatening American males. The suggestion is that Cuba was an opportunity for them to reassert their manhood, to blow off steam.
And there's actually a sort of rush to the colors by Americans eager to join the Army, eager to join the Navy. Everyone wants in. And there's a great story about Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders basically blocking the way of all the soldiers who were supposed to go to Cuba so that they could make sure his guys would actually get onto the ships.
Well, the main explosion took place on February 15th of 1898. And not long after that, in the month of March, we demanded that Spain repeal its reconcentrado policy. That was the policy of concentrating Cuban civilians behind barbed wire encampments, because the Spanish were not sure who were the farmers by day and who were the soldiers by night. We demanded that Spain agree to an armistice, a ceasefire, basically. We did not publicly and officially demand independence. However, that's really what the McKinley administration was insisting on.
Spain tries to comply with these demands to the extent that they understand them.
But General Maximo Gomez, who headed the Cuban Revolutionary Forces, was not about to agree to an armistice, because he knew that if he agreed to an armistice, then the shooting, of course, would stop, and peace might break out. And if peace broke out, there'd be no U.S. intervention. If there were no U.S. intervention, then most likely Cuba would remain within the Spanish Empire. So he told his troops, you keep shooting.
The United States declares war on Spain in April.
And attached to that declaration of war was the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment said that we would not annex Cuba in this war. the Teller Amendment had to be added to the war resolution because of the opposition among some of the Democrats and some of the anti-imperialists in Congress who were a bit suspicious that maybe, just maybe, this could be a war of imperial conquest.
The war, as Secretary of State John Hay characterized it, is a splendid little war.
It went just about as well as you could imagine, given the incompetence of the American Army. I think it's what's been neglected here is that the United States was fortunate in its choice of enemies. The Spaniards, if they had really taken on a first-rate power, the story would have been far different. And secondly, I think historians until recently have neglected the role of the Cubans, the guerrillas, who were actually holding down sizable numbers of Spanish forces. And if that hadn't been the case, then the American landing in Cuba could potentially have been quite disastrous. And then all bets would have been off. Who knows in what direction the war would have taken.
The Spanish-American War also is a time for a kind of reunion of sorts of the North and the South. But it's a white unity that comes at the expense of African Americans. They see black Cuban officers giving orders to soldiers of all different ethnicities, and they don't see that in the American army.
Black soldiers do, however, play a significant role in this brief war, providing critical defense for the Rough Riders as they charge up San Juan Hill.
If the black regulars had not been there, chances are that great heroic moment would have ended in tragedy, defeat, and maybe even the death of Roosevelt. At that moment of triumph on the top of San Juan Hill, native-born whites, Southerners, the black regulars, all of them celebrated and toasted each other. And at that moment, he celebrated the black soldiers. But when he came back to America and began to write the story of the Rough Riders, a man with great political ambitions, he determined that the inclusion of blacks in his story, telling of their contribution, would undermine his claim to national leadership and would also undermine his vision of what groups could combine to make a great America.